had planned the hike for weeks. The weather forecast said clear skies, and the map showed a trail that led deep into the mountains, away from any signs of civilization. I wanted something challenging, something that would push my endurance. I packed carefully: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, energy bars, water bottles, a compass, a map, and a lightweight stove. I double-checked everything, making sure I had extra batteries for my headlamp and my GPS, though I knew it might not work in the higher elevations. I left my phone on airplane mode to conserve battery, knowing that cell reception would be unreliable anyway. I wanted this hike to be completely about survival and awareness, about observing the land and moving carefully, not distracted by notifications or music. The morning started cold, with dew on the grass and a low fog hugging the edges of the trail. I wore a thermal shirt under a light jacket, my hiking boots tightly laced, and my backpack snug against my shoulders. The trail began easy, a narrow dirt path winding through dense pine trees. The scent of wet earth and pine was strong, and I felt the first thrill of being completely alone in the wilderness. I kept my pace steady, watching for loose stones or roots that could twist an ankle. My legs warmed up, my breathing became rhythmic, and the quiet around me was only broken by distant bird calls and the crunch of my boots on the damp ground. By mid-morning, the trail began to rise sharply. The incline tested my endurance, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath and sip water. I was aware of how quickly weather could change in these mountains, so I kept an eye on the sky. Clouds were gathering over the peaks, gray and thick, but there was no wind yet. I decided to push on, feeling confident in my gear and preparation. I passed a small stream, clear and cold, the water rushing over rocks with a soft roar. I knelt to drink, testing the water temperature with my hand first, and filled one of my bottles. The cold made me shiver for a moment, but it also refreshed me, giving energy for the next part of the ascent. As I climbed higher, the terrain became rockier. The trees thinned out, replaced by low shrubs and patches of grass. Loose stones underfoot made each step precarious. I concentrated on foot placement, testing each rock before putting my weight down fully. The air was thinner, making each breath more effortful. I stopped again, leaning on my trekking poles, looking down at the trail I had come up. From this height, the forest below seemed endless, a dark green blanket stretching to the horizon. I felt small and exposed, aware that a misstep could have serious consequences. Around noon, I reached a ridge that offered a clear view of the valley below. I took out a small snack and water, sitting on a large rock to rest. The wind had picked up, cold and sharp against my skin, and clouds now moved quickly across the peaks. I noticed the first sign that something was off. The sky to the east was darker than I expected, a rolling gray mass that seemed to move faster than the clouds normally did. I checked my map and compass, calculating distances and directions. My instinct told me I had time to reach a lower elevation before any storm arrived, but I also knew that mountain weather could turn without warning. I packed up carefully, making sure my gear was secure, and started down a different path that led to a slightly lower ridge, hoping it would be safer. Descending was harder than I anticipated. The loose rocks made footing uncertain, and the steep drop-offs along the side of the trail forced me to move cautiously. My boots slipped once, and I caught myself with my trekking poles just in time, heart pounding. The trail curved around a cliff face, and I paused to catch my breath, trying to calm the rapid beat of my heart. I realized that being alone up here meant that one mistake could have consequences far beyond just a scratch or bruise. I felt the seriousness of the isolation. There was no one for miles, no way to call for help if I fell or got injured. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Around mid-afternoon, the storm finally arrived. Rain began as a drizzle but quickly turned into a steady downpour. The trail became slick with mud, and the rocks gleamed dangerously under the wet surface. I pulled out my rain jacket and covered my backpack with a waterproof cover, trying to keep my supplies dry. Visibility dropped as fog rolled in from the higher peaks, thick and white, making it difficult to see the trail just a few feet ahead. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the trekking poles tightly, eyes scanning every step. The wind started to howl, pushing against me and threatening to throw me off balance at several points. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I felt my hands and face growing numb. I realized that I had made a critical decision. I had followed a shortcut marked on my map, hoping to save time. Now, with the storm raging, it became clear that the path was poorly maintained and dangerously steep. I could feel my boots sliding with every step, mud and loose rocks making it almost impossible to keep a steady footing. I debated turning back, but retracing my path meant ascending a slope that was now slippery and treacherous. I had to keep moving forward. Each step became a test of balance and strength. I concentrated on the immediate ground, ignoring everything else, but the fear in the back of my mind grew with every misstep and slip. Hours passed. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the trail seemed endless. I was soaked, cold, and exhausted, muscles burning with fatigue. My water bottles were nearly empty, and I had eaten most of my energy bars just to keep up strength. I considered stopping to rest, but the rocks were slippery and offered no safe place to sit. I pressed on, holding on to any tree or rock I could reach for support. The fog was now so dense that I could barely see 10 feet ahead, making navigation a serious concern. I kept checking my compass and map repeatedly, confirming directions, but the anxiety of being lost compounded the physical exhaustion. By evening, the storm had grown stronger, lightning flashing across the sky, though far enough that I could only see the illumination, not hear the thunder clearly over the wind and rain. I realized that I needed shelter urgently. Continuing on the trail seemed impossible. I looked for a natural overhang or a clearing where I could set up my tent quickly. After what felt like hours of searching, I found a small rocky alcove partially sheltered from the rain. It wasn't ideal, but it offered protection from the wind and water. I crawled into it, shaking from cold and stress, and quickly set up my tent inside the alcove. I crawled in, shaking uncontrollably, wrapping myself in the sleeping bag, trying to preserve any warmth I had left. That night was the worst. The storm raged outside with unrelenting fury. Water seeped into the edges of the alcove, splashing against the tent, and the wind howled like it was trying to tear the shelter apart. I couldn't sleep, just lay curled in the sleeping bag, shivering, muscles aching, every sound amplified by fear and exhaustion. The reality of isolation struck me fully. If I slipped or became injured here, no one would find me for hours, maybe even days. I rationed the small amount of food I had left, sipping water sparingly. The cold seeped into my bones, but I focused on controlled breathing and mental imagery, recalling previous hikes and techniques for conserving warmth. Every hour felt like a lifetime, and I watched the storm outside, aware that moving in it could easily be fatal. At first light, the storm had eased. The rain was gone, replaced by low-hanging clouds and a thick fog. I emerged from the alcove cautiously, testing the stability of the rocks. The trail was still muddy and dangerous, but with daylight, I could better see the path ahead. I carefully navigated down, using trekking poles and testing each step before committing my weight. My muscles were stiff and sore, and my boots left deep impressions in the mud. I took breaks whenever I found a safer spot to stand or a solid rock to sit on. The descent was slow, painstaking, and mentally exhausting, but I focused on one step at a time, refusing to rush. By mid-morning, I reached a flatter section where the trail widened and was more stable. I felt relief flood through me. The forest thickened again, offering better footing and clearer paths. I could hear the distant sound of a stream and birds cautiously returning after the storm. I paused to drink, eat, and let my muscles rest, feeling the first real sense of accomplishment since the storm hit. I checked my map and compass, confirming that I was now on the main trail that led down to the valley. The terrain continued downhill, gentler slopes and firmer earth making the hike less dangerous. I could finally walk with some confidence, though still wary of slips and loose stones. As afternoon arrived, I saw the first signs of human presence. Footprints in the mud, a faint dirt road, remnants of a campsite. I followed them carefully, aware that each step brought me closer to safety. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where I could see a small ranger station at the base of the mountain, and beyond that, the road leading back to civilization. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me. I had planned the hike for weeks. I had been through smaller trails, had climbed hills, and had gone camping alone a handful of times, but this hike was going to be different. The area I had chosen was remote, not often visited, and known for its rough terrain and sudden weather changes. I wanted the challenge, the isolation, and the kind of peace you only get when there is no one around for miles. I packed my bag carefully. Plenty of water, a full meal, a first aid kit, extra clothes, a flashlight, matches, and a small folding knife. My map was folded in the side pocket, and my phone, though carrying little service, had a GPS app loaded with the trail. I double-checked everything, then left my apartment early in the morning, driving for over 2 hours to reach the trailhead. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail wound through a dense forest of pine and oak, and the morning sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin golden streaks. Birds sang in the distance, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I felt energized, taking long steps, breathing in the fresh air, and letting my mind quiet. Hiking alone had a rhythm to it. Each step, each breath, each glance around the forest added to a sense of focus and solitude. I passed small streams and rocky outcrops, carefully watching my footing. Occasionally, I would pause to take in the view, noticing the way the sun caught the moss on the rocks or the way a spider's web glistened in the light. Everything felt familiar yet full of hidden detail. After a while, the trail became steeper. Roots and rocks jutted out in uneven patterns, forcing me to slow my pace. I had to hold on to branches and occasionally scramble up rocky slopes. My legs burned and my heart raced, but I welcomed the exertion. That's when I noticed the first sign that this trail wasn't well traveled. Broken branches, subtle disturbances in the dirt, and faint markings on the trees suggested that someone had been here, maybe recently, but there was no one around. It was quiet, apart from the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt a thrill, a mixture of excitement and unease, but I shook it off, assuming it was just my mind picking up shadows and shapes in the forest. Around midday, the sun was high, and I reached a plateau that opened into a small clearing. I sat down to eat and drink, letting my bag rest beside me. As I ate, I noticed something unusual, a set of footprints near the edge of the clearing. They were too large and deep to be an animal, and they seemed fresh. I traced them with my eyes, wondering where they had come from, but the footprints disappeared into the trees. A small sense of tension crawled up my spine. I told myself it was probably just another hiker who had passed through earlier. I wasn't worried, just alert. I finished my snack, refilled my water bottle from a small stream nearby, and continued along the trail. By mid-afternoon, the trail became even narrower, winding along a ridge that overlooked steep drops on both sides. The forest was thicker here, and the sun barely reached the ground. I moved carefully, watching every step, aware that a single misstep could be disastrous. I felt a sense of isolation deepen. There were no birds, no wind, nothing but the faint sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The quiet was profound, almost oppressive. I noticed how uneven the path had become, with loose rocks and slippery patches of dirt. My legs were tired, but I pushed on, knowing I was close to reaching the top of the ridge. As I climbed, I began to feel uneasy. Something about the forest felt off. I couldn't see anyone, yet I had the sensation of being watched. Shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. I kept looking around, scanning the trees, the underbrush, and the rocks, but saw nothing. I reminded myself that I was tired, that my mind could play tricks after hours of hiking. But the feeling persisted, and it grew stronger. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, the silence seemed louder, and the stillness more complete. I noticed that the path ahead was less defined, almost as if it had been abandoned or avoided by most hikers. The terrain was rugged, and I had to climb over fallen logs and squeeze through narrow gaps between rocks. My palms were scraped, my legs scratched, and my energy was fading, but I kept moving. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me freeze. A loud, distinct crack, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. I paused, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came from somewhere off the trail, deeper into the forest, but not too far away. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Then another crack, closer this time, followed by the rustling of leaves. I realized it was not a deer or any wild animal I knew. This was heavier, deliberate, and it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I considered turning back, but I was already too far up the ridge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had taken a different path, but the thought did little to calm me. I clutched my knife, just in case, and moved cautiously, keeping my eyes on the shadows. The trail became almost unrecognizable. Rocks were loose, roots were exposed, and the ground was damp from recent rain. I had to climb on all fours at some points, my fingers clawing at the soil for stability. Every step felt precarious. I could feel exhaustion creeping into my muscles, making every movement more difficult. I started to pay attention to my surroundings in more detail. The way the moss clung to the rocks, the small holes in the ground where insects had burrowed, the faint traces of water running through the earth. The forest had become darker, even though the sun was still up. The canopy above was thick, and light barely reached the forest floor. I realized I had been so focused on the trail that I hadn't noticed how quickly the day was passing. By late afternoon, the forest became eerily quiet. The rustling and movement I had heard before had stopped, and there was only the sound of my own footsteps. I felt disoriented. The trail markers, which had been sporadic before, were now almost non-existent. I paused to look at my map, but the GPS signal was weak, and I couldn't get a clear reading. Panic started to bubble under the surface. I knew I had to stay calm, but the combination of fatigue, isolation, and uncertainty made it difficult. I decided to continue, reasoning that I had to keep moving forward rather than risk getting lost in the dark. As I hiked, the terrain worsened. Steep inclines turned into sheer drops, and the path narrowed to almost nothing in places. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and I had to cling to trees and roots to keep from falling. I felt a surge of fear. I had trained for rough terrain, but this was beyond what I had expected. My legs trembled, my arms ached from holding onto roots and branches, and my heart raced. I started to notice small things that unsettled me. Broken branches that didn't look natural, patches of dirt that seemed disturbed, and faint, human-like footprints in the mud. My mind started racing with worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to focus on one step at a time. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip toward the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the trail, making the path ahead even harder to see. I realized I might not make it back before nightfall. I checked my supplies. Water was low, food was almost gone, and I hadn't used my flashlight yet, hoping to avoid running out of batteries. My body ached in every joint, and my mind felt frayed. I considered finding a place to rest, but the ground was uneven, and the idea of staying in the forest overnight without a clear plan terrified me. I forced myself to keep moving, careful with each step, alert to every sound and shadow. Then I slipped. My boot caught on a hidden root, and I tumbled forward, scraping my arms and legs against rocks and soil. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me, and I lay there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. Pain radiated through my body, and I realized I had a sprained ankle. The full weight of my situation hit me. I was alone, deep in a remote forest, injured, exhausted, and night was approaching. I felt a surge of fear, the kind that tightens your chest and makes your stomach churn. I took a moment to breathe, assessing my injury. My ankle was swollen and painful, but I could still move it slightly. I knew I had to keep going, even if it meant crawling part of the way. I improvised a makeshift bandage with part of my shirt and wrapped my ankle as best as I could. Each step was agony, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on rocks and roots. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees, shadows, and obstacles. The sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a branch under my weight were the only noises. Time became distorted. I couldn't tell how long I had been moving, how far I had gone, or how much further I needed to reach safety. My mind oscillated between hope and despair. I thought about my apartment, my bed, the shower I would take, and the warmth of home. Those thoughts gave me a small surge of motivation. Night fell. The forest became an almost I had been planning this hike for months, going over every detail in my head, imagining the forest trails, the scent of wet pine needles, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the cold mountain streams that I would cross along the way. I was alone, as I usually preferred it, enjoying the quiet and the solitude that hiking gave me, away from the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless emails and people's problems. I left early in the morning, before sunrise, parking my car at the trailhead when the sky was still dark, gray, and heavy. I could see my breath in the cold air as I tightened the straps on my backpack, checking to make sure I had water, snacks, first aid, and the basic essentials I always carried. I had a small map tucked into a plastic sleeve in my chest pocket, a compass, a whistle, and a fully charged phone, though I knew deep in the woods it might not work. The silence of the morning was thick, broken only by the distant sound of birds waking up somewhere in the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I started walking down the trail, and at first it was easy, almost peaceful, the way I had imagined it. The path was muddy in places from recent rain, and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled the air. The sun slowly started rising, sending streaks of pale light through the dense canopy of trees, painting the forest floor with dappled gold and green. At first, the hike felt like every other hike I had done. The incline was gentle, and I took my time, breathing steadily, enjoying the sound of my boots on the soft ground and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Birds flew overhead, and I could hear the faint trickle of water from a stream I would cross later. I stopped once or twice to drink and eat, pulling small pieces of granola bars from my pack. I was following the map carefully, making mental notes of the landmarks, big boulders, forks in the trail, and clusters of trees that stood out. I always liked knowing exactly where I was, but in a place like this, in the middle of a forest, a single wrong turn could be dangerous. The forest felt alive, in the most ordinary sense. Leaves trembling in the wind, the sun moving across the sky, birds calling, squirrels darting across the trail. Nothing strange, nothing threatening, just nature and me. I reached a point where the trail split, and according to the map, I was supposed to take the left fork. The right fork looked like it led up a steeper hill, and at first I was tempted to take it for the view. I paused, looking at the two options, trying to imagine the terrain ahead. The left fork looked safer, flatter, more predictable, and that's what I chose. I walked on for another hour or so, feeling a little tired but otherwise fine. The forest had changed slightly. The trees were taller, older, and closer together, with moss covering the trunks and roots twisting across the trail. It smelled wetter here, more earthy, and the ground was uneven, full of hidden roots and rocks. I had to watch my step constantly, paying attention to the path beneath me. After some time, I realized the trail markers were getting less frequent. Usually, there were small colored stripes painted on trees, but here, they were sparse or worn away. I started to feel a mild unease, the kind that hikers feel when they know they are still on a marked trail but something is subtly off. I paused to check my map and compass. According to the map, I was still on track, though I had gone further than I had expected. I drank some water and rested on a large moss-covered rock, trying to calm my nerves. The forest was quiet now, almost unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes every small sound, like the flap of a bird's wing or the snap of a twig, seem amplified. I could feel my pulse quicken slightly. I decided to keep moving, telling myself I just needed to find the next marker. After a while, I noticed that the trail became narrower, more like a path animals had worn than a maintained trail. The ground was soft from rain, with mud in patches that made me slip once or twice. I kept my eyes on the map, trying to match the contours with the hills and small valleys around me. The further I went, the more I realized that something felt wrong. The sun was higher now, but the canopy was thick, and the light barely penetrated through. The forest seemed denser, darker, and the path more confusing. I started paying attention to landmarks more than I had before. A crooked tree here, a large fallen log there. But no matter how hard I looked, the markers that should have been there weren't. My unease grew into real concern. At one point, I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on the map. Both paths looked similar, overgrown, muddy, twisting into the trees. I stopped and considered my options. My instinct told me to turn back, but I had already gone far. The other thought was to pick a path and keep going, hoping it would reconnect with the main trail. I chose the right fork, which seemed slightly wider. I walked slowly, trying to stay aware of everything around me. The trees here were enormous, their roots spreading like veins across the ground, making every step a careful negotiation. Branches brushed my arms, and the damp smell of moss and wet bark filled the air. I reminded myself that I had done this before, that I could handle being alone in the forest, but the thought of being truly lost was creeping into my mind. Hours passed, though it felt longer. The forest seemed to shift subtly, as if the trees rearranged themselves, and the path became harder to follow. Small streams cut across the trail, and I had to step carefully on slippery rocks. My boots were wet, my socks damp, and the chill of the air made my fingers stiff. I stopped once more to check my map. According to my calculations, I had strayed far from the main trail, though I was trying to trace my route carefully. This realization hit me hard. I was lost. My heart started beating faster. I sat on a rock, trying to think. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, which meant I had only a few hours of daylight left. I needed to decide, stay put or try to find the main trail. Staying seemed safer, but I had no food for a long stay, and I didn't have a signal to call for help. I decided I had to keep moving, retracing my steps as best as I could. I turned around, trying to remember the twists and turns I had taken. The forest seemed unchanging, but I focused on the landmarks I had noted. The large moss-covered rock, the fallen tree, the twisted roots. I walked slowly, carefully, stepping over roots and around mud patches. I stumbled once, catching myself on a tree branch. My palms scraped, and the sting made me more alert. I kept moving, following the faint trails I had made earlier. Hours passed. The sun continued to drop, and the forest grew darker and colder. My backpack felt heavier with every step. My water supply dwindled, and I realized I had underestimated how long it would take to navigate back. Panic started to creep in. I had to calm myself. I reminded myself of basic survival rules. Keep moving, stay hydrated, stay warm, stay aware. The forest began to change. The trees were thicker now, older, and the undergrowth denser. I had to push through bushes and branches that tore at my sleeves. The path was almost invisible, and I had to use my hands to feel for roots and rocks. Every sound made me tense. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the distant call of an animal. I tried to convince myself it was all normal forest noises, but the growing darkness made everything feel amplified. I realized that I had been walking for hours in circles. The landmarks I had thought I recognized were no longer familiar. I felt a wave of fear I hadn't experienced before. Being alone, wet, cold, and lost in a forest, far from help, is different from anything else. The logical part of me understood that I was not yet in real danger, but the fear was primal, physical, making my muscles tense, my stomach churn, my heart race. I kept walking, hoping to find some clue, some trail, some sign of civilization. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest became almost completely dark. I had a small headlamp, but it only illuminated a small circle in front of me. I moved cautiously, feeling the uneven ground with each step. I had to climb over a fallen tree that was large and slippery with moss. My hands were scratched and bleeding, my legs tired and sore. I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly. I needed a landmark, a high point, something to help me orient myself. I remembered the map indicated a ridge nearby. If I could reach it, I might get a view of the surrounding area and find the trail. I aimed for it, moving slowly, cautiously, through thick undergrowth. The climb was grueling. My boots sank in mud. My hands scraped against rocks and branches. I stopped several times to catch my breath, my chest burning, my arms trembling. Every time I thought I was close, the ridge seemed to stretch further away. Finally, after what felt like endless effort, I reached the top. From the small clearing at the ridge, I could see the forest around me, though in the darkness, everything was shadowed. I scanned the area carefully. I had been planning this hike for months. The trail I picked was not the popular kind that everyone knew about. It was one of those lesser-known paths in the northern mountains, a place where few people went and even fewer returned to tell their stories. The maps online were vague, the descriptions scattered across different forums, but the photos showed a rugged, raw beauty I couldn't resist. I packed lightly, or so I thought: backpack, water bottles, some trail mix, a first aid kit, my phone with an external battery, and my small emergency blanket. It was early September, the air crisp but not cold, the kind of day where the sunlight feels sharp and the shadows deep. I told myself it was the perfect day to get lost in the mountains and test my limits. The hike started smooth. The trail was narrow, winding through thick pine forests that smelled of resin and wet earth. Birds darted in the high branches, squirrels scurried across the roots of massive trees, and a distant creek gurgled under fallen logs. I had my headphones in at first, listening to nothing in particular, just keeping a rhythm for my steps. As I climbed higher, the trail became steeper, rocks jutting out in uneven staircases. Every so often I paused to catch my breath, drinking water and scanning the trees for any sign of wildlife. By mid-morning, the trail had grown more challenging. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and fallen branches forced me to step carefully. I could hear the wind picking up higher on the ridge. I hadn't seen another hiker in hours, and the forest was eerily quiet except for the natural sounds of the mountain. That quiet began to gnaw at me. My brain tried to tell me it was normal, that the mountain was just isolated, but a low, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I brushed it off, attributing it to hunger and exertion. Around noon, I reached a plateau with a small, flat clearing. I set down my pack to eat some trail mix and drink water. From here, the view opened to distant peaks, green fading into gray rock, the valleys deep and shadowed. It was breathtaking. I thought about setting up my camera to capture the scenery, but I was moving on a tight schedule to reach the next waypoint before sunset. I had a habit of underestimating the speed at which mountain terrain slowed me down. After the plateau, the trail narrowed to almost nothing. It clung to the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop on my left. There were no guardrails, just the rocks and the pine roots snaking across the path. I had to use my hands to steady myself at times. The sun was high, but the forest canopy blocked much of it. Then, the unexpected happened. A sudden, sharp sound, like a tree snapping, echoed through the forest. I froze. My eyes scanned the slope below and the trees above, but there was nothing. No animals, no wind, just that sudden, piercing crack. My heart sped up, and for a moment I considered turning back. But pride and curiosity pushed me forward. I didn't notice how fast the light was changing. By early afternoon, shadows stretched long across the path, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on my map. One path hugged the cliff, narrow and rocky. The other dipped slightly into a shallow valley that disappeared into thick trees. I hesitated. The cliffside path looked faster, but the slope below seemed unstable. The valley path looked safer, but I could see that the brush would slow me down. I chose the cliffside path, thinking that I was experienced enough to handle it. It was a choice I would regret. The path immediately became treacherous. Loose gravel gave way underfoot, and my hands scraped against jagged rock. Every step demanded my full attention. A misstep here could be fatal. I moved slowly, heart racing with each precarious step. Then came the sound of movement below. Something or someone was in the trees at the base of the cliff. I froze. There was a faint rustling, almost synchronized with my own movements. I scanned the slope, but the dense brush made it impossible to see anything clearly. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some small animal, but instinct screamed otherwise. The forest was too quiet for an animal that size, too calculated. My pulse quickened. The trail became even narrower, and I had to sidestep along the rock face, feeling the drop beside me. Every footfall seemed louder than it should be. I thought about going back, but the thought of retracing that cliff path with my legs shaking was worse than continuing forward. That's when the storm hit, an unexpected wind gust that rattled the pines and sent loose gravel skidding down the slope. I lost my balance for a second, my hands sliding on the rock. My stomach dropped as I scrambled to regain footing. I clutched the roots of a nearby tree and prayed they held. By late afternoon, the wind died down, but the forest around me felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I realized I had underestimated the trail's difficulty and overestimated my stamina. My water was running low, and my phone had weak signal. I had not prepared for the possibility of being stuck out here after dark. Panic, which I had kept at bay all day, started to creep in. Every shadow looked like movement, every sound amplified in the silence of the mountains. I forced myself to keep walking, one careful step at a time, hands brushing against cold rock, feeling the sweat on my back cool in the mountain air. Eventually, I reached a small, overgrown clearing. It was flat enough to sit, but not really a campsite. I dropped my pack, my legs shaking, my hands scraped and dirty. I examined the sun, less than an hour of daylight left. The idea of continuing seemed insane. I had a few choices: try to find a proper trail, wait in the clearing until morning, or risk descending down a slope that was too steep for comfort. None of them felt safe, but I knew that spending the night exposed on the cliffside, with wind and cold, could be worse. I gathered loose branches to make a small shelter against a rock outcrop and laid my emergency blanket beneath me. The wind picked up again, rattling through the trees. I had to suppress every instinct to scream or panic. My stomach growled, and I ate the last of my trail mix slowly, savoring each bite. I drank sparingly, conserving water, knowing I couldn't risk running out completely. The night was long. Darkness enveloped the forest, swallowing all sense of distance. The wind howled in the treetops, carrying an almost tangible chill. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my muscles tense. I had wrapped myself in the emergency blanket, but the cold still seeped through. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of a tree, every sound of the rocks shifting, made my mind race. I thought about staying awake until first light, but exhaustion claimed me in short, restless bursts. Morning arrived with a gray light, revealing a world that looked calmer than it had felt in the night. The trail ahead was still treacherous, but the climb and descent were more visible, more manageable with daylight. I packed my minimal belongings and started moving carefully down the slope. I had memorized landmarks during my cautious night in the clearing. Each step required focus, each handhold needed testing before trusting it. By mid-morning, I had descended into a shallow valley. The trees were thinner, the underbrush less oppressive. That's when I saw it, footprints, large, human, fresh. They followed the trail I had taken last night, but there were no other signs of where the person had come from. My pulse quickened again, but this time with a different intensity. I realized I had not been alone the previous day. Someone had been following me, maybe observing, maybe just coincidentally on the same path. I scanned the surroundings, looking for movement, but saw nothing. My phone still had almost no signal. I had to rely on my wits. I kept moving, careful to stay aware of every sound, every shift in the shadows. Eventually, I found a narrow dirt road, barely visible through the brush, but enough to follow down the mountain. It was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, but it led toward a more obvious path. By afternoon, I reached a ranger station, or what I think had once been one. It was abandoned, the windows broken, the door barely hanging. I could see signs of recent human presence, discarded bottles, cigarette butts, but no one around. I rested there for a while, trying to calm my nerves and figure out the next step. Finally, I found the main hiking trail, heavily traveled and well-marked. I followed it all the way down to the nearest small town. I passed other hikers who gave me curious looks. My clothes were dirty, my hands scratched, my face pale and sunburned in patches. I finally found a store, bought water, food, and a map for safer trails. I called my family, letting them know I was alive, explaining nothing else. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that I was back in civilization. The experience stayed with me long after I returned home. I replayed every moment, every decision, every misstep. I never found out who or what had followed me. The thought lingered in the back of my mind every time I planned a hike. I had been planning the hike for months. The trail I picked was one of the more remote routes in the region, a place few people went because it was long, isolated, and physically demanding. I was drawn to it because I liked the challenge, the solitude, and the chance to disconnect completely from everything. I packed my backpack carefully the night before, making sure I had enough water, food, first aid supplies, a compass, and a map. My gear was new, everything meticulously chosen for long-distance hiking. Waterproof boots, a durable jacket, gloves, a headlamp with extra batteries, and a sleeping bag suited for cold weather. I double-checked everything multiple times because I knew that in a place like that, a small mistake could become dangerous quickly. I started the hike early in the morning, just as the first hints of light were breaking through the dense forest. The trail began as a narrow dirt path that wound through thick pine trees. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Birds called from the treetops, and the occasional squirrel darted across my path. I had been hiking for about 2 hours before the first sense of unease crept in. The forest felt quieter than it should have, almost unnaturally quiet. Every now and then, I would hear the rustle of leaves, but it was fleeting, and the sound would vanish before I could locate it. At first, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I was imagining things because I was alone. The trail soon became more challenging. Large roots and rocks jutted out of the ground, and the incline grew steeper. I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath and adjust my pack. Sweat soaked my shirt, and my legs began to ache from the constant strain. Still, I pressed on, following the map carefully. I knew that if I strayed from the marked path, I could get lost very quickly. The area was known for its confusing network of side trails that often looped back on themselves. After about 4 hours, I reached a small clearing. It was beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the trees in golden shafts and illuminating a tiny creek that ran through it. I knelt to drink some water and to rest my legs. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground near the creek had footprints. They were human, but they were unusually large, and they weren't in a place that seemed like anyone would hike. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't completely faded either. I felt a twinge of unease. My first thought was that another hiker might be on the trail, but the thought made me nervous. There shouldn't be anyone else here, at least not on this path. I quickly stood up, packed my water, and decided to keep moving, telling myself it was probably just a hunter or someone who had wandered off the main trail. By mid-afternoon, the weather started to change. The sky darkened, and clouds rolled in quickly, the wind picking up as the temperature began to drop. I checked my map and realized I was further along than I had thought, which was good because it meant I was making progress, but also bad because the sun would be setting soon. The forest ahead grew denser, the trees closer together and the undergrowth thicker. The path became harder to follow, and the faint trail marks on the trees were all I had to guide me. I kept reminding myself to stay calm and focused, to watch my footing, and to keep track of my location. After a while, I began to hear another sound that I hadn't noticed before. Snapping branches. It was distant at first, then gradually closer. My heart rate picked up. The sound didn't have a natural rhythm. It wasn't a deer or a bird. It was irregular, like someone or something was moving through the trees. I stopped and listened, straining to hear more, but the sound would pause whenever I tried to focus on it. My stomach sank as I realized I was completely alone. The idea of encountering someone with bad intentions on this remote trail suddenly felt real. I forced myself to stay calm. I checked my compass, then the map, and decided to push forward to a point I had marked as a safe spot where I could set up camp. I thought that if I made it there before nightfall, I would be fine. But as I walked, the snapping noises continued, and I realized I could no longer hear the creak behind me. The forest felt oppressive. Every step I took seemed louder than the last, my boots crunching against the pine needles and fallen branches. The shadows from the trees grew long and strange, twisting across the path in ways that made it hard to judge distances. Night fell faster than I expected. The dim light disappeared entirely, leaving me with only my headlamp. I switched it on, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The forest looked different under artificial light, distorted, menacing. The snapping noises seemed closer now. I began to feel a real physical fear. My stomach tightened, my legs shook slightly, and my breath came in short bursts. I considered stopping and making a fire to signal my position, but I had no dry wood in that dense, damp forest. I decided to push forward, telling myself I just had to reach the campsite marked on my map. Then I made a critical mistake. I took my eyes off the path for a second, looking at the map, and my foot landed on loose soil near the edge of a steep incline. I slipped, my body tumbling down several feet, scraping against rocks and branches. Pain shot through my shoulder and ribs. I rolled onto my back, catching my breath, and inspected myself. Nothing appeared broken, though the pain was intense. My pack had shifted, and some supplies had scattered, but I quickly retrieved them. The fall reminded me that in this forest, one small mistake could become dangerous very fast. I knew I needed to focus and move carefully, but the fear had begun to cloud my judgment. I pressed on slowly, carefully placing each step, using a walking stick I had brought for stability. The snapping noises still followed me intermittently, and now my mind started to imagine worst-case scenarios. I had trained myself to think rationally, but adrenaline and fear were making every shadow seem like a threat. I tried to remind myself that humans weren't the only source of danger in the forest. Wild animals could be dangerous too, especially at night. I kept my headlamp moving constantly, scanning the forest around me, listening for any unusual sound. Hours passed, and I realized I had no idea where I was. My GPS had limited battery left, and cell service was non-existent. Panic started creeping in, but I forced myself to calm down and reassess my situation. I remembered that the trail had been marked with orange tags on trees. I scanned the surrounding trees with my headlamp, and finally, I spotted one about 10 meters ahead. Relief washed over me. I started to follow the markers, moving slowly, carefully, trying not to make any noise that could attract unwanted attention. Then I heard the sound again, crunching leaves, deliberate steps. This time I could hear it behind me. My heart raced and I froze. I tried to listen, but the forest was too dense to pinpoint it accurately. I considered running, but the uneven terrain and my earlier fall made that extremely risky. I decided my best option was to stay on the trail, keep moving cautiously, and hope the source was just another hiker or a harmless animal. I kept my walking stick ready, my headlamp beam scanning constantly. At one point, I slipped again on a moss-covered rock and fell forward, scraping my hands badly. Blood ran down my fingers, and I realized the trail had become far more treacherous in the dark. I had to use both hands and feet to steady myself as I navigated the slope. Every few meters, I paused to listen for the footsteps that seemed to follow me. They would start and stop unpredictably, always just far enough away that I couldn't confront whatever was there. I realized that my fear was as much about the unknown as the trail itself. Hours passed. I was exhausted, cold, and dehydrated. I forced myself to drink water, eat a few bites of trail mix, and rest for brief moments on the few flat rocks I could find. The moon had risen now, but the forest canopy blocked most of its light. I realized I had been moving in circles. The trail markers were fewer and farther apart. I had been relying on memory, map, and compass, but fatigue and fear had made me second-guess every decision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a wider clearing. My heart sank as I realized this wasn't a designated campsite. It was just an open area in the middle of the forest, with no shelter and only a thin layer of soil over hard rocks. I knew I couldn't continue much further. My energy was nearly gone. I set down my pack, tried to organize my supplies and decided to make a small sleeping area using my sleeping bag and ground cover. I wrapped myself tightly, trying to stay warm. I could hear the forest at night, branches creaking, distant animals calling, the wind moving through the trees. The snapping noises had faded somewhat, but the fear lingered. I forced myself to stay awake as long as possible, monitoring every sound. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke before dawn, cold but alive. I checked my map and compass and realized I could trace a route to a nearby ranger station about 6 miles away. I had been planning this hike for months, marking the trail on my map, checking the weather reports, and making sure my gear was ready. I wanted a long solo hike through a remote part of the mountains, somewhere I knew few people went. The area I picked was known for its dense forests, steep inclines, and sudden weather changes. I had done solo hikes before, but this one was meant to be the longest and most challenging I had ever attempted. I left early in the morning, carrying a heavy backpack filled with essentials: food, water, first aid kit, map, compass, extra clothing, and a small stove. My boots were broken in, my jacket waterproof, and my sleeping bag compact but warm. Everything felt in order. The first few miles were calm. The trail was marked but narrow, winding through tall pines and thick undergrowth. Birds called occasionally, and the wind rustled the branches above me. The ground was soft in places, damp from last night's rain, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. The early morning sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long golden rays across the forest floor. I was in good spirits, my steps steady, my breathing even. I felt completely at ease. As the day wore on, the terrain became rougher. Rocks appeared, the trail narrowed further, and steep inclines forced me to climb more carefully. I had to use my hands at times to steady myself on slippery boulders or to grab roots sticking out of the ground. My pack felt heavier with every step, my muscles burning from exertion, but I welcomed the challenge. I kept drinking water, eating small pieces of trail mix, and making sure my pace was steady. Around midday, I reached a small creek. The water was clear and cold. I drank directly from it after using my filter, and I filled one of my bottles for later. The sound of the water trickling over the stones was soothing, and I took a short break, letting my legs rest. After the creek, the trail climbed sharply again. Trees gave way to more open terrain with large rocks and patches of moss. The air felt cooler, and clouds were gathering in the sky. I paid attention to the weather, noticing that the wind had picked up. I decided to push a little further to reach a flatter area where I could set up camp if the storm came sooner than expected. As I climbed, I noticed that the trail was becoming less distinct. The markers were faint, and I had to double-check my map and compass several times. I didn't mind at first. This was part of the adventure. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened considerably. The clouds were thick and gray, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I pulled my rain jacket over my head and adjusted my pack. The wind increased, pushing against me as I climbed. I tried to find a place to take shelter, but the ground was uneven, and rocks made it difficult to find a safe spot. I knew I couldn't stop for too long because hypothermia could set in if I got wet and chilled. I forced myself to keep moving. Around late afternoon, I made a mistake I would regret. I thought I saw a flatter area through a break in the trees, so I headed toward it without fully checking the terrain. The ground was slippery with wet leaves, and hidden roots tripped me. I fell once, scraped my arm and leg, but nothing serious. I took a moment to catch my breath and check my gear. My ankle felt slightly twisted, but I was still able to walk. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, that I could continue carefully. By early evening, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. Visibility was poor. I kept following the trail markers, but they were faint, and I realized I had lost track of the exact path. Panic started to creep in. I had no cell signal, and the trail seemed unfamiliar, though I had been following it all day. I slowed my pace, tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The wet moss, the slick rocks, the trees pressed close together. I stopped to rest, leaned against a tree, and tried to think clearly. I had prepared for emergencies, but nothing could fully prepare you for being lost in a dense, wet forest as night approached. I decided I needed to find some kind of high ground, a place where I could see landmarks or at least stop safely for the night. I climbed over boulders and pushed through dense underbrush. My clothes were soaked, my hands cold, and my energy draining. My ankle throbbed with every step. I could feel my heart racing, not just from exertion but from worry. The forest around me was growing darker, and the rain was relentless. I realized I had no choice but to make a temporary shelter, even if it wasn't ideal. I found a slight depression in the side of a hill, partially protected by an overhanging rock. It wasn't much, but it would keep me out of the direct rain. I cleared away wet leaves and debris, laid my sleeping bag down, and used my backpack to shield against the wind. I started a small fire using wet wood and tinder I carried, but the rain made it difficult. I had to shield the flames carefully, and it took longer than expected. Finally, I managed a small fire, just enough to keep me warm and dry. I ate some of my remaining food and drank water. My body was shaking, not from cold entirely, but from exhaustion and fear. As the night fell, I realized how isolated I truly was. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded the rocks above my shelter. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I reminded myself to stay calm, to ration my energy, and to think logically. I spent the night checking my map, planning a safe route down, and trying to rest. I slept fitfully, waking several times to ensure the fire was still alive. The next morning, the rain had lessened, but the forest was wet and heavy with fog. My ankle was sore but manageable. I decided I needed to move and find the main trail. I retraced my steps as carefully as possible, using landmarks I remembered: large boulders, unusual tree shapes, and the creek I had crossed the day before. Progress was slow. Every step required concentration, and I had to constantly check my compass and map. Around mid-morning, I stumbled across a faint trail marker I had overlooked the previous day. Relief flooded me. I followed it cautiously, knowing that one wrong step could send me off again. The terrain gradually became easier, the trees thinner, and the ground less treacherous. By late morning, I reached a larger trail I recognized from my map, the main path leading down the mountain. The feeling of safety, even partial, gave me energy I didn't know I had left. I followed the main trail carefully, still cautious but moving faster now. The sun broke through the clouds, drying some of my wet clothes and giving me warmth. I spotted other hikers in the distance. Even though I was tired, sore, and muddy, I felt a surge of relief and gratitude. I waved to them silently, not wanting to stop but needing confirmation that I was finally heading the right way. By early afternoon, I reached the trailhead. My body ached from the long day and night, my clothes soaked and caked with mud, my hands scratched and dirty, but I was safe. I took a deep breath, looked back at the forest and mountain I had just navigated, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I realized how small mistakes could escalate quickly into dangerous situations, how careful preparation and staying calm under pressure had saved me. I took the time to drink water, eat, and rest before driving home. The hike had been one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had faced exhaustion, disorientation, severe weather, and the very real danger of injury in a remote area. I had been scared, yes, but I had survived. And the clarity of being safe at the end, knowing I had managed everything through careful thought, perseverance, and patience, made the fear I had felt all the more vivid and memorable. I knew I would never take preparation lightly again, and I understood how fragile safety could be in the wilderness. But I also knew that I had learned something invaluable: how to remain calm, think clearly, and act decisively when everything feels against you. The forest still loomed in my memory: the rain-soaked trails, the narrow passages, the feeling of isolation, the relentless wind, the sound of water over stones. But it was no longer terrifying. It was a challenge I had overcome. That experience had left me exhausted, sore, and soaked, but it had also left me stronger, wiser, and more aware of the raw power of nature. I returned home that evening, cleaned my gear, tended to my scratches, and rested. Over the next days, I reflected on the ordeal, realizing how easily things could have gone differently, how every decision mattered, how a single misstep could have escalated into disaster. I appreciated the small comforts of safety and warmth more than ever before, and I knew that, despite the fear and the struggle, the hike had been worth it. Not for the thrill, but for the knowledge, resilience, and respect it had given me for the wilderness and myself. I remember waking up that morning with a sense of purpose I could not entirely explain. The sun was barely rising, and the thin morning air carried a crispness that made me feel alert, alive, almost electric. I had packed my backpack the night before with care, double-checking each essential item: water, trail maps, a compass, extra layers of clothing, food, a first aid kit, and my small survival tools. I had planned this hike for weeks, but what I did not anticipate was how unforgiving and unrelenting the wilderness could become when things went wrong. The trailhead was quiet. I parked my car at the small lot where the gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out. A faint mist hung low over the ground, dampening the smell of earth and pine. I looked around, the trees standing tall like silent guards, their shadows stretching across the path. The trail ahead seemed benign, almost welcoming in the early morning light, but I had read enough survival stories to know that appearances could be deceiving. I set off, my backpack snug on my shoulders, my hiking poles clicking against the rocks and uneven ground. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound gently upward, moving through dense pine and spruce forests, crossing small streams that gurgled over smooth stones. Birds chirped faintly, and the smell of wet moss and soil was almost intoxicating. I felt content, invigorated even, as I navigated the switchbacks, enjoying the rhythm of the trail and the solitude. Around the 4th mile, the terrain began to change. The trail narrowed, and the forest thickened. Fallen logs blocked parts of the path, and the underbrush scraped against my legs. I noticed the temperature dropping subtly, and the mist that had lingered in the morning had become a thin, persistent fog. Visibility decreased, and the world seemed muted, sound swallowed by the dense air. I paused to adjust my jacket and take a drink of water, scanning the area around me. Everything seemed normal, yet I felt a strange unease creeping in, the kind of feeling you get when the human mind notices tiny inconsistencies that don't yet form a full picture. As I continued, the trail became harder to follow. I relied more on my map and compass, marking landmarks mentally to make sure I wasn't drifting off course. I passed a narrow ravine where the ground dropped sharply, its edges slick with moisture and moss. I carefully picked my steps, aware that a misstep could send me tumbling down into the darkness below. A rustle in the underbrush made me freeze, my heart pounding, but it was just a small animal, a fox or raccoon, darting away at the sight of me. Hours passed, and I realized I had ventured further than I had intended. The trail markers, faint and weathered, were increasingly hard to spot. I stopped to check my map and compass, and that was when I realized something alarming. I had lost my bearings. The landscape, while familiar from the trail's start, now seemed alien. Trees looked alike, slopes and ridges mirrored one another, and the fog had thickened enough that I could see barely 20 feet ahead. Panic bubbled beneath the surface, a slow, insidious thing that tried to convince me that I was in a hopeless situation. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. I was trained to handle this, to navigate carefully, to survive. But knowing the theory and facing reality were two entirely different things. I decided to backtrack, following what I hoped was the same path I had taken. Every step felt heavier, my boots squelching through damp leaves, the terrain now slippery and treacherous. My legs ached from constant climbing and descending, my arms sore from using my hiking poles to steady myself. Hours turned into what felt like endless wandering, and the sun began to dip toward the horizon. Shadows grew long, blending with the mist, making it almost impossible to tell tree from rock, slope from ravine. That's when I heard it. A low, subtle sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere off to my right. First, I thought it was the wind. Then it repeated, irregular but deliberate. A crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch. Something was moving. My heart rate spiked, my senses on high alert. I tried to peer through the fog, but the visibility was barely 10 feet. I started making slow, cautious steps, keeping my weight low, scanning constantly, trying to make sense of the direction of the sound. I could not tell if it was an animal or a person. By nightfall, I realized that I had made a serious miscalculation. The sun was gone, swallowed by the dense fog and the thick canopy. My headlamp provided a limited cone of light, enough to see the immediate trail but not the surrounding woods. The air was damp and cold, seeping through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. I could hear my own breathing and the sound of my boots crunching over debris. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle amplified. I tried to find a place to set up a temporary shelter, a patch of flat ground safe from the steep slopes, with a small rise behind me so I wouldn't be completely exposed. I managed to find a narrow clearing, just enough to sit and organize my gear. I set up my emergency bivy bag, taking care to keep dry, stacking my supplies within reach. Hunger and exhaustion clawed at me, but I rationed my energy carefully. I drank water sparingly, ate small portions of dried food, and tried to stay alert. I checked my compass and map repeatedly, trying to plan a safe route back in the morning. But sleep would not come easily. Every sound, every movement in the fog seemed to grow in significance, each one a potential threat. Around midnight, the noise returned. This time, it was unmistakable. Deliberate, rhythmic, and coming closer. I stayed completely still, listening. My mind raced through the possible dangers: wild animals, other hikers lost in the fog, predators that might be drawn to a lone human. I held my survival knife in my hand, knowing it offered little real protection, but it was something tangible to cling to. The sound circled my shelter, moving in the shadows, testing me, and then it stopped. Silence followed, so deep it pressed against my eardrums, broken only by my shallow, panicked breathing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep, too tired to think clearly. When dawn finally broke, a muted gray light filtering through the fog, I cautiously unrolled my bivvy, packed my gear, and assessed my surroundings. The tracks around me confirmed that something or someone had been near me. There were large prints in the mud, irregular but intentional, circling and disappearing into the forest. My stomach churned with fear, but I forced myself to focus. Panic would kill me faster than the forest ever could. I decided to move deliberately, using my compass to navigate toward the nearest known trail junction, marking landmarks as I went. Hours of careful walking brought me to a rocky outcrop that provided a higher vantage point. From there, I could make out the faint outline of a river in the distance, a trail I recognized from my maps. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I was not safe yet. The journey downhill would be treacherous. The fog had not lifted entirely, and the terrain was slick with moisture. Using every bit of caution, I made my way down. I tested each foothold, leaned into my hiking poles, and kept my senses alert for any movement around me. By mid-afternoon, I reached the river. Its fast-moving current gleamed in the weak sunlight. Following it downstream, I spotted the trail markers I had hoped to find. Exhaustion hit me in waves, but the relief was palpable. I was not out of danger yet, but I was on a path back to civilization. Hours later, I stumbled onto a maintenance road where vehicles occasionally passed. I flagged down a ranger who was surveying the area. My appearance must have been alarming. Mud-stained clothes, torn sleeves, dirt covering my face, eyes wide with fatigue. The ranger immediately called for backup, radioing for a vehicle to come and assist me. I was treated, given water, food, and medical attention, and slowly, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and relief that I was alive. That night, in a small ranger station, I reflected on everything that had happened. The forest was not malicious, not alive in a supernatural sense, but it was indifferent. Every misstep, every lapse in attention, every miscalculation could have been fatal. I realized that my training, preparation, and careful decision-making had been the only things keeping me alive. Fear had sharpened my senses, forced me to slow down, to think critically, to survive. In the weeks that followed, I made changes to my approach to hiking. I invested in better navigation tools, practiced emergency skills repeatedly, and learned to respect the forest as an unpredictable force. That experience remained etched in my mind, a stark reminder of how quickly things could turn dangerous, how fragile our sense of control really is when faced with nature at its most raw and unyielding. I never underestimated the mountains again. I never assumed that a simple hike could not become a life or death situation. And most importantly, I had been planning this hike for months, not a casual weekend walk or a tourist trail, but a serious backcountry trek that would push me further into the mountains than I had ever been before. I had my map, my compass, my pack loaded with food, water, and extra clothing. The trailhead I chose was obscure, one I had discovered in a detailed guidebook of remote mountain hikes. According to the description, it would take me across rugged terrain, dense forest, and eventually to a high ridge where I could see the valley below. The solitude was part of the appeal. I liked being alone in nature, hearing only the wind through the trees and the occasional distant call of a bird. The first few hours were straightforward. The trail was steep but manageable. I passed old, fallen trees with moss clinging to them, small creeks that ran over rocks and pebbles, and slopes where the dirt was loose, forcing me to plant each foot carefully. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves stand out. My backpack felt heavy, but I was in good shape, so it wasn't uncomfortable. The sunlight filtered through the trees in long streaks, painting golden lines on the forest floor. Birds and insects moved around, some hidden, some making soft noises that I barely noticed. I felt at peace at first, energized by the rhythm of hiking and the sense of isolation. By midday, I reached a small clearing with a shallow pond. The water was still and clear, reflecting the sky above. I took off my pack and sat on a flat rock, taking a break. I drank some water, ate a sandwich, and just stared at the reflection in the water. There was a faint smell of wet soil and moss, a scent that reminded me of childhood hikes with my father. I didn't notice how the sky had begun to change. After a short rest, I packed up and continued. The trail narrowed and became rockier. Some areas required scrambling over large stones and roots that twisted across the path. At one point, I had to carefully climb down a small cliff using both hands and feet. My muscles ached, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. I felt alive. I noticed more signs of wildlife now. Animal tracks in the mud, scattered feathers, the smell of pine resin and damp earth. Then things began to change. The trail, once clear, became less defined. The markers on the trees were faint, almost faded, as if they hadn't been maintained for years. I checked my map and compass, and I was still on course, but there was a creeping sense of unease I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself that it was normal. I had read about backcountry trails being overgrown, and I wasn't inexperienced. It was late afternoon when I reached a section where the slope became even steeper. Loose gravel and fallen leaves made footing tricky. I slowed down, focusing on each step. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me freeze. Not a shout, not a call, just a low rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I stopped and listened. The sound stopped too. My heart rate quickened. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but there was something about the timing, the way the leaves moved, that didn't feel natural. I decided to keep moving. Every so often, the rustling sound returned, always stopping when I stopped. I checked behind me several times, trying to see through the dense forest, but the thick trunks and shadows made it impossible to identify anything clearly. I didn't panic, but I felt the first real tension of the hike. Hours passed. I had to navigate tricky terrain in diminishing light. The sun dipped lower, and the forest began to darken. I had brought a headlamp, but I preferred not to use it yet, wanting to conserve batteries. The temperature dropped. My fingers and ears grew cold, and the wind seemed sharper between the trees. My pace slowed because my muscles were fatigued, and every rustle in the forest felt amplified. At one point, I reached a small stream I had to cross. The rocks were slick with moss and moisture. I placed my hands on a tree branch for balance and carefully stepped across. My boots slipped once, but I caught myself. My heart pounded. Once I was safely on the other side, I sat on a rock to catch my breath. I was exhausted, cold, and uneasy, but I pressed on. Then I realized I had taken a wrong turn. My map and compass showed that I was veering off the intended trail. There were no clear markers anymore. Panic rose slightly in my chest, but I forced myself to calm down. I backtracked, trying to find the last marker I had seen. The underbrush grew thicker, and I had to push branches aside. The sun was almost gone, and shadows created illusions in the trees. Every movement in the periphery of my vision made me tense. Night fell quickly. I turned on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness but only a few feet ahead. The forest seemed endless. Every sound was magnified. The snap of a branch underfoot, the distant drip of water, the rustle of leaves. My pack felt heavier, my legs tired and stiff. I realized I hadn't considered how difficult finding a campsite would be in this area. There were no flat clearings, only uneven ground, tangled roots, and slopes. I finally spotted a small flat area near a large tree. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the steep slope around it. I dropped my pack and set up a makeshift shelter using a tarp. I crawled inside, wrapped myself in a sleeping bag, and tried to calm down. The forest was alive with nighttime sounds. The calls of owls, the rustle of small animals, the wind through the trees. I tried to sleep, but every sound kept me alert. I could feel the isolation pressing in, making me hyper-aware of every movement. Around midnight, I heard something else. A deep, low growl, distant but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening. Then it came again, closer this time. I realized I was in bear territory. I had considered wildlife when planning the hike, but the thought of encountering a bear alone in the dark made my skin crawl. I stayed as still as possible, whispering to myself that the bear probably hadn't noticed me. I had no food outside my pack, and my tent was secure, but the sound kept circling, coming closer and moving away intermittently. I stayed awake for hours, heart racing, barely breathing. The first light of dawn brought some relief. The bear had left, or at least the sounds had stopped. I packed up quickly, my mind still on edge, but I needed to continue. I kept to the compass direction, staying away from dense underbrush. By mid-morning, the forest began to thin. The terrain was still rugged, but I could see farther, which helped my nerves. Eventually, I reached a ridge. The sun was higher now, and the visibility gave me perspective. I could see the valley below, a patchwork of trees and fields. Relief washed over me. I took a long break, eating and drinking while studying the valley for a route down. The descent was steep, but I could identify clear paths that would eventually lead to roads. I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. The tension of the previous night made this moment feel like a victory. The hike down was challenging but less threatening. I had learned to move carefully, watch my footing, and read the terrain. The forest gradually gave way to shrubs, then open meadows, then a faint dirt road. I followed it until I reached a small ranger station at the edge of the valley. The ranger, seeing my tired and dirty appearance, gave me water and helped me check in. I explained briefly where I had been. He nodded knowingly. These trails were tricky, especially for solo hikers. I spent the night in a nearby cabin, safe and warm. I thought back on the hike, the beauty, the isolation, the fear. It had been terrifying at times, but I had survived by staying calm, thinking clearly, and being prepared. I realized that the forest was not just a place of beauty, but a place that demanded respect. Mistakes could be dangerous, even deadly, and the solitude that had drawn me in also magnified every risk. By morning, I felt a deep appreciation for both the challenge and the lessons learned. The hike had tested my endurance, my mental strength, and my awareness. I packed my things carefully, double-checking every strap and knot. I walked back to the road, where I could see cars and signs of civilization. The contrast between the quiet, tense nights in the forest, and the human activity around me was almost shocking. I felt grateful for the experience, but also a new humility about nature's power. The trip had been longer and more frightening than I had anticipated, but it ended with a clear sense of accomplishment. I had navigated through darkness, confusion, and fear, and I emerged safely, carrying memories etched with vivid detail. The sounds of the forest at night, the cold bite of wind, the weight of isolation, the tension of unseen dangers. These were the things that made the hike unforgettable. I knew I would hike again, but I also knew I would never underestimate the wilderness again. It demanded respect, preparation, and constant awareness. I never thought of myself as someone who would get lost, not really. I had hiked a lot in the years before that day, weekend trips, solo treks through forested trails, climbs up low mountain ridges, but I always stayed careful. I always carried a map, a compass, a fully charged phone, extra water, and food. That day, though, everything changed, and it started like any normal hike. It was early spring, and the air was still sharp with the last traces of winter, but the sun was already strong on the south-facing slopes. I had driven a few hours into the mountains to hike a trail I had read about in a small guidebook. The trail was supposed to be moderate, a loop of around 12 miles that would take 6 or 7 hours. I packed lightly but carefully: water, a few granola bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, my phone, and a light jacket. I left my car in a tiny dirt lot by the trailhead, and I remember feeling the usual surge of excitement as I stepped onto the path. The forest was quiet except for the occasional snap of twigs underfoot and the distant calls of birds. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. The trail was narrow and winding, lined with tall pines and spruces, and patches of melting snow underfoot made me tread carefully. I paused occasionally to take pictures, not really thinking about how much time I was spending on the way. Around midday, I reached a clearing, a small meadow with a creek running through it. The sun made the water sparkle, and I stopped to refill my water bottle and eat a small snack. I remember looking at the map, seeing the loop ahead of me, and thinking that the second half of the trail would be easier. That was the first mistake. I assumed I could just follow what I thought was the right path without really checking my location. After the meadow, the trail dipped into a densely wooded area. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, and the air became cooler and damper. I followed the narrow track, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. About an hour into this section, I noticed the trail markers were becoming sparse. Small ribbons tied to branches here and there, painted blazes on trees, but not as frequent as before. I thought nothing of it at first. I had been in less marked areas before. Then, after crossing a small stream, I realized I hadn't seen any markers for at least 10 minutes. I looked at the map again, comparing it to the terrain, trying to find the next point I should reach. That's when the first real sense of unease set in. The trail seemed to disappear into a tangle of fallen branches and dense undergrowth. I stepped carefully, trying to follow what I thought might be a path, but it became harder with every step. The trees were taller here, older, and the ground uneven with hidden roots and loose rocks. I started to realize I had no idea which direction I was heading. I stopped and sat on a fallen log, trying to calm myself. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I always knew that in remote areas, cell service could vanish, but I hadn't really felt the panic of it before. I tried to trace my steps back, but the path had become confusing. Every branch, every bend in the trail seemed identical, and I quickly realized that I couldn't trust my memory of the route. The sun was dropping slowly, and shadows grew long. My heart started to race. I tried to retrace my steps along the small creek, thinking that following water downhill might eventually lead me to the main trail or a road. The forest became thicker, the creek narrower and harder to follow. At some point, I misstepped on a slick rock and twisted my ankle. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't crippling. Still, it slowed me down and added a new layer of fear. As I moved, I kept looking around for anything familiar. Trees with unusual shapes, rocks with markings, but nothing felt familiar. Every time I tried to climb a slight rise to get a better view, The trees blocked my sight. I began to feel a creeping isolation I had never felt before. The kind of isolation that isn't just physical but mental. A sense that there was no one, no way, and no plan to get back. By late afternoon, the temperature started dropping. I had a light jacket, but the wind in the gaps between the trees made it feel much colder. My water was low, and I had eaten all my snacks. My twisted ankle throbbed constantly. I tried to tell myself to stay calm and conserve energy, but the reality was terrifying. I was alone, lost, and injured. Hours passed. I walked, stumbled, and rested intermittently. I kept trying to follow the creek, thinking that water might lead to a road or inhabited area. But the terrain was rough, the ground uneven, and the creek sometimes disappeared into boulders or under fallen trees. I realized I might have been following a small tributary that didn't connect to anything useful. Night was falling, and with it, an almost complete darkness. I had a flashlight, but using it drained the small batteries quickly. I found a place to rest for the night under a cluster of tall pines, leaning against a large tree trunk. I wrapped my jacket around me as best I could, trying to keep warm. I drank the last bit of water slowly, savoring every drop. I tried to sleep, but every sound, the wind moving branches, the distant call of some animal, made me jump. I thought about hypothermia, about getting hurt further if I moved in the dark, about being trapped here alone until someone found me. Panic was always at the edge of my thoughts, and yet I forced myself to breathe and stay rational. Morning came slowly. I didn't sleep much, maybe a few hours in fits and starts. When the first light broke through the trees, I looked around and tried to get my bearings. The forest seemed endless, the path lost. I knew I couldn't stay in one place, though, because my food and water were nearly gone. I had to move. Carefully, slowly, I limped along what I hoped might be a trail or a game path. My ankle ached with every step, and my legs were stiff. Hours passed. I saw no trail markers, no signs of other hikers. Occasionally, I spotted animal tracks, deer, maybe a fox, but nothing human. I tried to keep moving downhill, thinking that eventually, any slope would lead to a stream or road. At some point, I realized I had underestimated how much energy I would burn in such rough terrain. My legs screamed, my ankle felt worse, and the thought of collapsing crossed my mind more than once. By late morning, I spotted a small rise ahead and decided to climb it, hoping to get a better view. It was exhausting, and my ankle protested every movement. When I reached the top, I looked around and saw something that brought relief. A faint dirt road cutting through the trees, just a few hundred yards away. I didn't know if it led to anything, but it was human-made, and that was enough. I limped toward the road, moving as fast as my ankle allowed. When I finally reached it, I realized it was a logging road, rarely used, but still visible and clear. I followed it slowly, making sure not to slip or twist my ankle further. The road wound through the forest, up and down slight inclines, but eventually, after what felt like hours, I heard the sound of a truck engine. My heart leapt. I waved my arms and shouted. Even though my voice was hoarse and weak, the truck slowed, and the driver, a man in work clothes, stopped and helped me. He gave me water, a blanket, and called for emergency services using his radio. I explained where I had started and roughly where I had been lost. They told me to stay put until a ranger arrived. A few hours later, a ranger found me, took me back to the trailhead, and checked my ankle. It was swollen but not broken. I felt a wave of relief and exhaustion that I hadn't expected. I realized just how close I had come to serious injury, dehydration, or worse. In the end, I learned a few lessons that were hard-earned. No matter how experienced I thought I was, nature is unpredictable. Trails can disappear, paths can be confusing, and an injury, no matter how small, can turn a simple hike into a life-threatening situation. I also realized that staying calm, conserving energy, and making rational decisions, even when panicked, were the things that saved me. That day, I walked away physically unharmed enough to continue life normally, but mentally, I carried the memory of that fear, that isolation, and that helplessness. It changed the way I approached hiking forever. I always carry extra water, extra food, a GPS device, and I never underestimate the trail again. The mountains are beautiful, but they are also indifferent to our presence. They demand respect, careful planning, and humility. That day I was lucky, and I knew it. I had survived something far more frightening than any story or legend could have prepared me for. The stark, raw, and unforgiving reality of being lost, alone, and unprepared in the wilderness. I had been planning this hike for months. I wanted something challenging, far from the crowded trails and the easy paths people usually follow. I needed solitude, the kind that only a deep, rough forest can give. I packed my backpack meticulously. A first aid kit, extra water, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, protein bars, and a couple of cans of beans. I also brought a flashlight with fresh batteries, a small knife, a compass, and a map that covered the trail I intended to follow. I left my car early in the morning, when the sun was still low and the air was cold and sharp. The parking lot was empty except for one other car at the far end. The forest greeted me quietly, with the crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth. The path was narrow, almost hidden by fallen leaves, and the sound of my boots crunching over twigs echoed strangely in the stillness. First, everything felt ordinary. Birds chirped faintly in the trees. A squirrel darted across my path, and the occasional deer tracks impressed me with the reminder that I was deep in the wild. I felt alive. My steps were measured. I kept checking my map to ensure I stayed on the right trail. The plan was to hike for 3 days, camping overnight at a clearing I had identified on the map. I had done enough research to know the terrain would be steep, and I was ready for long stretches of climbing and descending. By mid-morning, the trail became less defined, almost hidden by the overgrowth of ferns and moss. I realized quickly that the forest was wilder here than anywhere I had ever hiked. Around noon, I found a small stream and stopped to drink. The water was cold and surprisingly clear. I refilled my bottle and washed my hands, enjoying the refreshing chill. But as I continued on, the terrain became more treacherous. The path sloped sharply upward, and I had to navigate over slippery rocks and loose soil. At some point, I lost sight of any markers or blazes on the trees. My compass reassured me I was still headed generally north, but the map didn't match the exact terrain anymore. I paused, crouched on a rock, breathing heavily, scanning the trees and the forest floor. Everything looked different here. I knew the feeling. The place was remote enough that few people ever walked here. That thrill I initially sought now carried a subtle weight of anxiety. As I pushed further, I noticed the forest floor was littered with broken branches, as if some large animals had passed through recently. The occasional rustle in the bushes made me tense. I wasn't naive. I knew bears and mountain lions inhabited these forests, but I convinced myself I had enough awareness and preparedness to avoid trouble. Still, my pace slowed, eyes darting constantly. The sun was high overhead, but the dense canopy dimmed it, leaving everything in a soft green-gray light that made shadows seem sharper and movement more threatening. By late afternoon, I realized I had lost the main trail entirely. I stopped to study the map, comparing it to the compass and the surrounding terrain. The contour lines suggested a small ridge that would lead to a clearing where I intended to camp, but from my current location, the ridge seemed distant and unreachable through the thick undergrowth. I debated whether to backtrack, but I estimated that going forward might actually bring me closer faster, even if the path was uncertain. I adjusted my backpack and continued, careful to note landmarks in case I had to retrace my steps. The forest became increasingly silent, except for the occasional creak of a branch or the distant call of a crow. The further I climbed, the steeper and more unstable the slopes became. Loose rocks slid under my boots, forcing me to take careful, deliberate steps. My muscles burned, and sweat soaked my shirt despite the cool air. Every snap of a twig or shift of leaves made me tense. I wasn't afraid in a panicked sense yet, but a persistent edge of unease settled into my chest. By evening, the light began to fade rapidly, and I realized I had no way of reaching the clearing before nightfall. The sun dipped behind the ridge, leaving the forest in a dim, green twilight that twisted shadows into grotesque shapes. I set up my tent on a small, uneven patch of soil, wedged between rocks and thick roots. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could do. Night arrived faster than I expected. I crawled into my sleeping bag, heart racing slightly from the exertion and the isolation. The forest noises changed. Distant branches cracking, leaves rustling as small animals moved cautiously nearby, and an occasional low, grumbling growl echoing far off. Perhaps a bear, perhaps nothing. I told myself it was just part of the wilderness and tried to sleep. But sleep came fitfully. Every noise made me sit up and scan the dark shapes around my tent with my flashlight. I rationed my breaths to calm myself, reminding myself I had been prepared for this. Food, water, and shelter were all in place. Morning arrived cold and gray. I ate a small breakfast and packed quickly, anxious to find a route back to the main trail. The terrain seemed more hostile in daylight. Loose rocks and slippery moss covered nearly every surface. I kept my eyes on the compass, trying to maintain the correct bearing. But every slope I descended seemed to loop me back inwards, as if the forest itself resisted my progress. By mid-morning, I had hiked for hours without encountering any sign of the trail. My water supply was low, and I hadn't encountered any streams since the first day. Anxiety began to build more seriously now. I paused on a large rock, taking stock of my situation. No clear path, dwindling supplies, and miles of forest in every direction. I was truly alone, and every misstep could cost me badly. By early afternoon, hunger and fatigue weighed heavily. I moved more slowly, carefully selecting each step. The terrain shifted. Suddenly, the soil became looser, and I began encountering sharp rocks. My boots slipped once, almost sending me tumbling down a steep incline. Panic surged through me for a moment, but I forced myself to stay calm, holding on to nearby trees and rocks to regain my balance. I realized I needed a safer route, even if it meant longer travel. I veered slightly downhill, searching for a stream or small path that might lead toward lower ground and eventually to civilization. Hours passed. The sun hung low, and shadows lengthened, stretching the trees into ominous shapes. My feet ached, my hands were scraped from grabbing branches and rocks, and my back ached under the weight of my backpack. Just as the frustration and fear threatened to overwhelm me, I spotted faint tracks in the mud, human footprints, partially washed away, but distinct. My heart surged. Someone had been here. I followed them cautiously, praying they led somewhere safe. The footprints were irregular and sparse, but they moved in the general direction I needed. I continued to follow them, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, though a wariness remained. Whoever had made them might not return soon, but at least this confirmed that people traversed this area. Night fell quickly again. I had to stop and set up my tent in a small, flat area, surrounded by dense brush and a few larger rocks. Hunger gnawed at me, and water was almost gone. I ate what remained in my pack, careful to conserve every bite. I double-checked my flashlight and knife, imagining every possible hazard. Sleep was shallow. Every rustle, every shifting shadow, triggered a spike of adrenaline. I drifted in and out of consciousness, uneasy about the thought of wild animals or steep falls in the dark. The air was cold, and I shivered inside my sleeping bag. I told myself to focus on staying calm and preserving energy. The next morning, I forced myself to move quickly despite exhaustion. I followed the faint tracks downhill, where the ground leveled slightly. As the day progressed, I stumbled upon a small, clear creek. I drank eagerly, refilled my bottle, and followed the water downstream, hoping it would lead to a larger river or even signs of human presence. Hours later, my persistence paid off. I noticed a faint dirt road cutting through the forest, barely visible through the trees. Relief surged through me. I pushed toward it, every step an effort, but filled with hope. As I neared, I saw tire tracks and a signpost for hikers. Civilization was near. Exhausted, dehydrated, and hungry, I collapsed briefly beside the road, feeling the tension in my muscles ease. I gathered the last strength I had and walked toward the trailhead where I knew vehicles would be parked. Within an hour, I reached the parking lot. There were people and cars, a sound of human life that felt overwhelming after days in near silence. I approached the first person I saw, explaining my situation, and someone helped me get food and water. Eventually, I called for emergency assistance to report the section of forest where I had become lost, hoping to prevent others from experiencing the fear and danger I had. The relief of safety washed over me. I realized the forest had taught me an important lesson. Wilderness was beautiful but unforgiving, and even careful planning could be tested. I had been planning this hike for weeks, mapping out every section of the trail, checking topographic maps, reading forums for tips about the terrain, and making sure my gear was in top shape. I wanted this hike to be an escape from everything. From work, from noise, from the constant small worries that piled up over the weeks. I chose a remote section of the forested mountains in the northern range because it was rarely visited and promised long stretches of isolation. I knew that meant I would have to be entirely self-sufficient, carrying all my water, my food, and my safety gear. I had done long hikes before, but this one was different. I would be alone, completely immersed in a landscape that could be unforgiving if I made mistakes. The morning I started, the air was crisp, tinged with the smell of pine and wet earth. The forest floor was soft with a layer of fallen needles, and the trail was narrow, barely more than a footpath snaking through thick undergrowth. Sunlight filtered in patches through the trees, dappled and uneven, and every step I took was cushioned but unpredictable, with roots and rocks hidden under the layer of needles. My pack felt heavy on my back, more than usual, but I reminded myself it was necessary. Water, snacks, first aid kit, extra clothes, and a small emergency radio. The first few miles went smoothly. I walked at a steady pace, taking breaks every hour to drink water and stretch. The only sounds were my breathing, the occasional snapping of a twig underfoot, and distant birdsong. I felt a rare peace, almost meditative. There was a part of me that enjoyed being completely alone in the wilderness, relying entirely on my own preparation and judgment. The trail climbed gradually, winding along a ridge that offered brief glimpses of valleys far below, each a patchwork of green trees and occasional clearings. By midday, I had reached a small stream that crossed the trail. It was shallow but fast-flowing, and the rocks were slick with moss. I took off my pack and set my water filter up, refilling my bottle and drinking my fill. I washed my hands in the cold water, the chill snapping me slightly out of my calm. I paused there for a few minutes, leaning over the water, watching it move quickly over stones, hearing the constant rush of it. Even in that moment, I felt a subtle unease. The forest around me seemed almost too quiet, as if everything had held its breath. I shrugged it off as fatigue and continued on. The trail began to steepen sharply. The path became rocky, with loose gravel underfoot and jagged stones that made every step more precarious. My boots gripped unevenly, and I used my hands at times to stabilize myself on the steeper slopes. I kept an eye on the weather as well. The sky had started to cloud over by late afternoon, gray creeping into blue, but the forecast had promised clear weather. The wind picked up along the ridge, cold and biting, rustling the pines and making the tops of the taller trees sway. My pace slowed naturally, each step requiring more care. Then I saw it, a fallen tree, half blocking the trail ahead. It was large, perhaps from a storm weeks ago, with roots twisted into the earth on one side and branches jutting outward like broken fingers. I could have gone around it, but the path beside it was narrow, uneven, and steep. I decided to climb over it carefully. As I hoisted my pack over my shoulder, a sudden cracking sound echoed nearby. I froze, listening. It sounded like a branch snapping under weight. My heart rate increased, though I knew it was probably nothing more than a weak branch breaking under its own weight. I forced myself to continue, climbing over the log with slow, deliberate movements. After that point, everything changed. The trail, which had been relatively clear until then, began to disappear in patches. Loose rocks and undergrowth obscured the path, and I had to guess the continuation. At one point, I lost it entirely, standing at a rocky slope and realizing the path I thought I was on was gone. Panic started to creep in. I retraced my steps to the last recognizable marker, but even familiar landmarks seemed subtly shifted, altered by perspective or the fading light. I realized that I had misjudged the terrain. If I kept going, I could get lost entirely. I checked my map and GPS, but the dense canopy interfered with the signal. My map helped, but only in broad strokes, and I realized that my sense of scale was off. Hills that looked small on the map were steep cliffs in front of me. I tried to remain calm. I reminded myself that I had survived hikes like this before, but the isolation now felt heavier. Every sound in the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the occasional snap of a twig, seemed amplified, like the forest was aware of my misstep. Night fell faster than I expected. Clouds thickened, blocking out the sunset. The temperature dropped sharply, and I realized that I had misjudged the length of the hike. My stomach grumbled. I hadn't eaten much since my last break, and the fatigue from navigating the rough terrain was setting in. I needed to find a place to camp. There were no obvious clearings nearby, only steep slopes, thick underbrush, and rocky outcrops. I found a small ledge, just barely wide enough for me to sit, and set down my pack. I gathered dry leaves and pine needles to make a small bedding area, doing my best to create something insulated from the cold ground. The hours stretched, darkness enveloped everything, and I realized how little I could see beyond the reach of my flashlight. I rationed my battery, knowing that it was critical to keep some light for emergencies. I lay down on the makeshift bedding, shivering despite my layers, and tried to calm my mind. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the wind, by the occasional sound of animals moving in the dark, and by the nagging fear that I might have made a wrong turn that had led me miles off the trail. The next morning, I woke to a heavy fog. Visibility was almost zero, and the forest that had seemed vast and open the day before now felt claustrophobic. I carefully packed my belongings and began trying to orient myself. I retraced what I thought was the main path, moving slowly, testing each foothold. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Fresh tire tracks cutting through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was impossible. Vehicles weren't allowed on this trail, but the prints were undeniable. They looked recent. A sense of dread settled over me. Whoever had made those tracks might be nearby. I debated my options. I could try to follow the tracks, hoping they led to safety, or I could continue trying to stay on the trail I thought I had known. I chose to follow the tracks. They led me through increasingly difficult terrain. Rocky gullies, dense undergrowth, and finally to a faint dirt road I hadn't expected to exist. Relief flooded me, but it was mixed with caution. The tracks were fresh, and I could see indentations where someone's boots had left marks beside the tires. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, but I kept moving, staying close to cover where possible and keeping my pack secure. Eventually, the dirt road widened into a gravel access road. I saw signs of human habitation. A small, abandoned cabin off to one side, rusted tools, and an old vehicle missing tires. I felt a mix of relief and unease. There was evidence of people, but not the kind I wanted to encounter. I kept going, putting distance between myself and anything suspicious. Hours later, the gravel road ended at a small ranger station, unmanned at that hour but stocked with a phone and maps. I collapsed against the wall, exhausted, my hands shaking as I called for help. Rescue arrived within the hour. A team of rangers and volunteers guided me back to the main highway. They told me that the trail I had tried to follow was notorious for disorientation, with many hikers losing their way during poor visibility. They also confirmed my suspicion about the tire tracks. Some illegal off-road vehicles had been using the area, and the forest was a dangerous place for anyone alone. The experience left me physically exhausted and mentally raw. The sense of vulnerability, the isolation, and the realization of how quickly things could go wrong in the wilderness stayed with me for weeks afterward. But there was also a sense of clarity and accomplishment. I had survived purely through careful preparation, observation, and cautious decision-making. I had tested my limits, faced real fear, and emerged safe. After that hike, I became more meticulous about preparation, more humble about the wilderness, and more aware of the fine line between adventure and danger. I never underplayed the risks again, and I shared my story widely among fellow hikers as a warning. Even familiar-looking trails can be treacherous. Weather can change suddenly, and isolation magnifies the smallest mistakes. But the experience also reinforced a confidence I hadn't known I had. The knowledge that careful planning, attention to detail, and staying calm under pressure could carry me through situations that seemed terrifying at the moment. I returned home not just with relief, but with a profound respect for the wilderness and for my own resilience in facing it. I had always liked hiking alone. There was a strange clarity in being surrounded by the forest, listening only to the crunch of my boots on the trail and the soft whisper of the wind in the trees. That morning, I had set out early, before the sun was fully awake, eager to take on a trail I had never been on before. The route was known among local hikers, but it was long, challenging, and relatively isolated. It promised rocky ridges, dense pine forests, and occasional streams cutting through valleys. I liked the isolation, the sense that the world beyond the trees and the trail didn't exist for a few hours. It made the walk meditative, almost sacred in a way. I started with my usual routine: a light breakfast at home, double-checking my pack, making sure I had water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a few emergency tools like a knife and fire-starting kit. I had a map of the area and a compass, though in recent years I had relied heavily on my phone GPS as a backup. I told no one exactly which trail I would be on, only that I was going hiking. I liked that about myself, the independence. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. A narrow dirt road led to a small parking area surrounded by tall pines, their needles forming a thick, earthy carpet underfoot. The sun was barely breaking over the horizon, casting long shadows and a golden tint over the mist that hung low in the valleys. It was beautiful in a way that made you want to stop and stare, but I was eager to move. I tightened my backpack, adjusted my hat, and stepped onto the trail. First, it was easy. The path was well marked with occasional painted blazes on trees, and the incline was gentle. Birds chirped intermittently, and somewhere to my left, a stream gurgled softly, its sound both comforting and oddly isolating. I had my headphones with me but decided not to use them, preferring the natural soundtrack of the forest. As I walked, I could feel the tension in my shoulders slowly release. Being alone like this always cleared my mind, left room for nothing but the rhythm of my breathing and my footfalls. About an hour into the hike, the trail began to change. The ground became rockier, roots snaking across the path like twisted fingers. I had to watch every step, shifting my pace to maintain balance. The air had grown cooler, and a light mist was starting to form again, clinging to the underbrush and obscuring distant views. At this point, the trail was mostly uphill, steep enough that I had to pause every so often to catch my breath. I drank from my water bottle and adjusted the straps of my pack. Hiking alone meant that every mistake, every slip had consequences, so I moved deliberately, cautiously. Around the second hour, I noticed something that made my heart rate spike just slightly, though I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. Footprints. Human footprints, not old but relatively fresh, pressed into the damp earth. They weren't the kind of casual tracks hikers usually left. These were heavier, with a deep imprint that suggested a larger person or someone carrying weight. They were walking in the same direction I was heading. I paused for a moment, looked around, but the mist limited visibility to maybe 20 or 30 feet. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of branches. I told myself it was probably another hiker who had started earlier, but the trail was notoriously isolated, especially this early in the morning. I continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. The sound of my own footsteps seemed amplified now, and every snapped twig made me flinch. About 30 minutes later, the trail split near a small ridge. The left path was slightly more worn and appeared to continue the steady incline, while the right path seemed narrower, less maintained. I checked my map and compass, According to both, the main trail continued to the left. The footprints, however, veered to the right. I stared at them, the imprint in the soft earth too clear to ignore. They were not mine, and they were fresh enough that I knew whoever had left them had passed through recently. A sense of unease settled in, a subtle knot in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but the awareness that something could go wrong if I wasn't careful. I reminded myself of basic safety. Stay alert, don't make unnecessary risks, trust instincts. I took the left path, sticking to the main trail, and tried to focus on the hike itself, on my breathing, the stretch of the legs, the rhythm of walking. For the next hour, I climbed steadily. The trail became steep, rock-strewn, forcing me to use my hands occasionally to steady myself. The mist was thicker now, curling around the trunks of the pines and clinging to the moss on the boulders. Visibility was reduced to barely 10 feet in some places. I slowed my pace, each step deliberate. I kept hearing sounds, branches creaking as though someone or something was moving in the distance. I told myself it was wildlife, perhaps a deer or a fox, but the footsteps didn't match any animal I knew. They were heavier, deliberate. At some point, I stopped completely, standing on a ledge that overlooked a valley I hadn't noticed on the map. The mist created a veil over the slope, softening the outlines of the trees and the rocks. From this vantage point, I could see another set of tracks below, leading from the trail into the thick underbrush. They weren't mine. They weren't from the first set of footprints either, and they appeared to be moving in no consistent direction, almost like someone had wandered off the trail intentionally. The realization hit me. If someone had left these tracks and was now wandering through the forest, I couldn't predict where they were or what their intentions might be. I considered turning back, but retracing my steps on this steep, rocky path in the mist seemed just as dangerous. So I moved cautiously, keeping my eyes on the ground ahead, scanning for anything unusual. I thought about emergency protocols, staying visible, keeping calm, making noise if necessary. I didn't have a whistle, but I could shout if absolutely required. Still, I tried not to panic, telling myself that remaining calm was my best chance. By mid-morning, I reached a narrow gorge where the trail dipped sharply before climbing again. A thin stream ran at the bottom, cascading over rocks, forming small pools. I stopped here to refill my water bottle, crouching beside the stream. The sound of rushing water was both soothing and jarring, almost masking any distant noises. As I looked up, I noticed something alarming. A figure in the distance, partially obscured by trees, watching. It wasn't fully clear, but the stance was unmistakable. Someone had followed me this far. My heart raced and adrenaline spiked. I quickly stood up, tightened my pack, and made a deliberate decision to continue. I avoided any sudden movements, keeping the person in my peripheral vision as I climbed the ridge. The incline was brutal, and the path narrowed to barely 2 feet in some places, with sheer drops on one side. My legs ached. My hands scraped against rough rock, but I forced myself upward. Every few minutes I glanced back, but the figure remained, shifting through the trees in a way that suggested they were following cautiously, perhaps hoping I wouldn't notice. I realized I needed a plan. Panic wouldn't help me. I needed a way to ensure safety. My thoughts raced. Find a clearing where I could be seen, reach the main road, or gain higher ground where I could navigate safely. I chose to focus on reaching the summit of this ridge, hoping the open area at the top would allow me to see clearly and determine the next move. After nearly 2 hours of steep climbing, slipping on loose gravel, and carefully navigating moss-covered boulders, I finally reached a plateau. The mist was thinner here, and I could see for nearly 100 feet in every direction. No one was visible. I paused to breathe, wiped sweat from my brow, and assessed my situation. My legs trembled from exertion, but I felt a surge of relief that I had made it to this vantage point. Then I noticed movement below, a shadow moving along the forest floor. It wasn't the figure from earlier. This was closer, faster, and deliberate. Someone was actively trying to approach me without being detected. My mind raced. I had no desire for confrontation, but I knew I couldn't afford to stay in one place indefinitely. I checked my pack. I had water, food, a flashlight, knife, and a small fire starter. No firearm, no direct protection other than awareness and my own speed. I needed to get to safety. Looking at my map and the slope ahead, I realized there was a secondary trail leading to a ranger station about 3 miles away. It was steep, less direct, and not well maintained, but it was my best chance. I made a decision. I would descend cautiously, moving quickly enough to avoid lingering in one spot, but carefully enough to prevent injury. The descent was brutal. Loose rocks shifted underfoot. Mud patches clung to the soles of my boots, and every snap of a twig made my heart leap. I kept scanning constantly, moving as silently as possible while remaining alert. I had to focus on every step, every balance adjustment. The forest closed around me, and the mist thickened again, but I reminded myself that the ranger station